Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today we're diving deep into the heart of the Pacific Northwest, into a story that starts with solitude and ends with a question that will chill you to the bone. The air in the Gifford Pinchot National Forest was so thick with water and silence that it felt like a physical substance pressing against Sarah's eardrums. She was 3 days into her summer assignment, cataloging old growth timber for an independent firm. Her cabin, a heavy-set fortress of cedar and stone, stood 7 long miles off the main access road, built to withstand the relentless passage of time and the fierce elements. This isolation was meant to be a cleanse, a quiet escape from the constant grinding noise of Los Angeles. But now, it was starting to feel less like a retreat and more like a cage. Her only connections to the outside world were a sporadic landline and a weekly satellite phone check-in with her site manager, George. Her routine had become a comforting mantra. Hike, catalog, eat, read by the fire, sleep. A simple, predictable rhythm against the vast, untamed wilderness. But that mantra was shattered on the morning of the fourth day. The afternoon before, she had stacked 3 large moss-covered logs into a rough pyramid near her porch. She was absolutely certain of it. She remembered the strain in her back, the damp feel of the moss under her gloves. But now, they were gone. In their place stood a small, impossible monument, a cairn of 4 smooth gray river stones, stacked with a geometric perfection that defied the natural chaos of the forest. The stones were bone dry, as if they had been handled just moments before, yet the surrounding porch was still damp with morning dew. A shiver, cold and sharp, traced its way down her spine. This wasn't the work of wind. No animal could have done this. This was a deliberate act, an island of perfect order placed exactly where she had left her own messy work. It was a message. A human presence had violated her perimeter, moving with such impossible stealth that the immense silence of the forest had swallowed any evidence of their entry and their exit. The comforting illusion of solitude she had built around herself had just been torn away. She wasn't alone. The following morning she found another change. The axe, which she always kept wedged securely in its chopping block, was now lying on the ground, its blade pointed directly at her front door. It was a subtle shift, but the intention behind it felt loud and clear. It was a threat. Panic, cold and suffocating, began to set in. She called her site manager, George, her voice tight and strained. "George," she said, trying to keep the tremor from her words. "Something's wrong out here. Things are being moved. I think someone is watching me." George's voice crackled back through the satellite phone, full of a dismissive, patronizing calm. "Sarah, you're just getting cabin fever. It's a big, empty forest. Your mind is playing tricks on you." He told her to get some rest, to stop letting her imagination run wild. His words were meant to be reassuring, but they felt like a betrayal. He didn't believe her. She was truly on her own. That evening, as a thick, relentless rain began to fall, she saw him for the first time. Through the rain-streaked window, a flash of startling color against the endless green and gray. A figure, standing just at the edge of the clearing, draped in the bright yellow raincoat. The hood was pulled low, casting the face in deep shadow, but she could feel the weight of their gaze fixed on her cabin, on her. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She ducked below the window, her breath catching in her throat. She stayed there for what felt like an eternity, crouched on the floor, listening to the drumming rain and the frantic beating of her own heart. When she finally found the courage to look again, He was gone. Sleep offered no escape. Her dreams were haunted by that flash of yellow, a beacon of malice in the dark woods. She woke up exhausted, the line between nightmare and reality blurring. The days became a torment of hypervigilance. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through her system. The forest she had once admired now felt like a prison, its towering trees like bars on a cage. She saw him again and again, a fleeting glimpse through the trees on her hiking trail, a stationary figure standing on a distant ridge, watching her through binoculars. He never got closer, never made a sound. He was just there, a silent, persistent observer, a ghost in a yellow raincoat. The isolation and constant fear started to erode her sanity. Was George right? Was she imagining it all? She began to document everything, taking pictures of the moved objects, writing down the times and dates of the sightings. She needed proof. She needed to know she wasn't losing her mind. The weekly calls with George became her own personal hell. George, I saw him again. He was by the creek. Sarah, please. You need to pull yourself together. There's no one out there. We've had people working that sector for years. Each denial pushed her further into a spiral of despair and doubt. Her breaking point came a week later. She awoke to silence. The constant drumming of the rain had stopped. But this was a different kind of quiet. A heavy, expectant hush. On her porch, placed directly in front of her door, was a single, perfect, gray river stone, identical to the ones from the cairn. But this one was different. It was wet, and resting on top of it was a small, freshly picked wildflower. That was it. That was the final violation. It wasn't just a sign of presence anymore. It was a gift, an offering, an intimate gesture that felt more terrifying than any threat. He had been on her porch while she slept. She scrambled for the satellite phone, her hands shaking so violently she could barely dial. George, he was on my porch. He left something on my porch. She screamed into the receiver. But this time George's voice was different. There was no condescending calm. It was replaced by a strange, cold seriousness. Sarah, he said, his tone flat. What color was his raincoat? A sudden, icy dread washed over her, more terrifying than anything she had felt before. The question was too specific, too knowing. It was yellow, she stammered. Bright yellow. A long pause stretched over the line, crackling with static. The silence was deafening. Then George spoke, his voice low and heavy, each word landing like a stone. Sarah, we don't have anyone else assigned to your sector. And we haven't for 30 years. He paused again. Not since the last cataloger out there went missing. He was wearing a bright yellow raincoat when he disappeared. The line went dead. Sarah stood frozen, the phone still pressed to her ear, the silence of the cabin roaring around her. The forest was no longer just a place of isolation. It was a place of memory, of history, of a presence that had been waiting patiently in the rain for 3 decades. And now, it had finally found someone new to watch. What do you think happened to Sarah? Let me know your theories down in the comments. This story is a chilling reminder that sometimes the greatest horror isn't what's chasing you, but what's been waiting for you all along. Sarah spent the entire next day trying to convince herself that the stone cairn was nothing. You know how it is, right? You see something weird, and your brain immediately starts making excuses. Maybe it was the last person who lived here. Maybe it's just some strange local tradition, anything to make the world feel normal again. But that feeling, That gut-wrenching feeling of being watched, it just wouldn't go away. It was like a constant, invisible pressure on the back of her neck, especially whenever she found herself looking towards that dark, silent wall of trees. But the real terror didn't start until that night. That's when the thin veil of safety she'd wrapped around herself was torn to shreds. The clock on her nightstand glowed with the numbers 2:17 a.m. when a sound sliced through the suffocating silence of the cabin. This wasn't the usual bump in the night, not a snapping twig or the howl of some distant animal. No, this was a low, rhythmic dragging. Imagine something impossibly heavy being pulled, inch by painful inch, over damp, muddy earth. A sound that just crawls, right under your skin. It came from the north side of the cabin, the side that faced the deepest, darkest part of the woods. It was moving slowly, methodically, towards the back of the house. Sarah was frozen solid in her bed, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she thought it might break. The blood literally drained from her face. This sound, it was too regular, too intentional. There was a purpose behind it. It wasn't the random chaos of nature, like a falling tree or a clumsy bear. This was different. This was deliberate. She held her breath, straining her ears in the darkness, listening to that agonizingly slow cadence. Drag, pause, drag, pause. It seemed to go on for an eternity, each scrape of earth amplifying the terror in the room. And then, just as it reached a point she guessed was right behind the rear wall of the cabin, it stopped. The silence that followed was somehow even worse than the noise itself. It was heavy, expectant, like the world was holding its breath right along with her. Sarah lay there, rigid, until the first faint gray light of dawn started to creep through the window panes. Only then did she dare to move, her limbs stiff and cold. She grabbed the heavy iron poker from beside the fireplace. Not much of a weapon, but it was something solid to hold on to. Her hand was shaking so badly she could barely get a grip. With her heart in her throat, she unlocked the back door and stepped out into the cold, misty morning air. She followed the path where the sound had seemed to come from. And that's when she found it. Evidence. Proof that she wasn't going crazy. There, pressed into the soft, loamy soil, was a single, perfectly straight furrow. It was about 3 inches wide and just as deep, starting at the base of a massive ancient fir tree and running all the way to the corner of her back porch, where it stopped abruptly at the cold stone foundation. It was too straight, too impossibly uniform to have been made by a fallen branch or anything natural. Whatever had made that dragging sound was heavy, immensely strong, and moved with a cold, horrifying, and unnatural precision. The question wasn't what made the mark anymore. The question was, what was it dragging? The sight of that deliberate furrow in the ground was the final push I needed. It was time to take action. Before this whole assignment started, I'd set up 4 wildlife camera traps around the edge of the clearing. My plan was simple. Get some candid shots of deer, maybe a bear if I was lucky. I never imagined they'd become my only hope of figuring out what was going on out here. I rushed to the first camera, my heart pounding against my ribs. Untouched. Thank goodness. I moved on to the second one, further north, near the old fence line. It was also secure, exactly as I'd left it. A small wave of relief washed over me, but it didn't last long. The third camera, the one I had positioned specifically to watch the tree line where the furrow began, it was just gone, vanished. The heavy-duty strap that had secured it to the tree was sliced clean through. It wasn't torn or chewed. It was cut. I frantically searched the area for a solid 15 minutes, my eyes scanning every inch of the forest floor. That's when I found what was left of the fourth camera. It was about 50 feet down the slope, half buried under a clump of ferns. It hadn't been just knocked down or pulled off by some curious animal. The main housing was surprisingly intact, but the lens was completely smashed. A spiderweb of cracks radiated from a central point, a clean, precise break. It looked like someone had taken a small, heavy hammer and struck it with surgical precision. I carefully picked up the shattered pieces, my hands trembling uncontrollably. This wasn't the work of an animal. An animal would have chewed on it, clawed at it, or just knocked the whole thing to the ground. This was deliberate. This was sabotage. The person, or whatever it was, out there wasn't just watching me from a distance or leaving strange little gifts. They were actively, methodically disarming my defenses. The chilling realization hit me like a physical blow. They knew exactly where I had placed my cameras. They knew how to disable them, how to destroy them without leaving a single trace of their own image on the memory cards. The thought that every move I made, every breath I took, was being watched by someone who was essentially invisible. It felt like a noose tightening around my neck. The fear was no longer just a flicker in the back of my mind. It was a cold, constricting presence, squeezing the air from my lungs. I stood there, holding the broken pieces of my camera, feeling more isolated and vulnerable than ever before. The woods, which had once felt like a place of solitude and discovery, now felt like a cage, and I was trapped inside with a predator who was always one step ahead. They weren't just observing me, they were playing with me. This was a game, and I was just beginning to understand the rules. They had taken away my eyes, leaving me blind in the darkness that was quickly gathering around me. What were they planning? What was their next move? And more importantly, how could I possibly defend myself against an enemy I couldn't even see? The silence of the forest was no longer peaceful. It was heavy with unspoken threats. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sent a fresh jolt of terror through me. I was completely and utterly alone, and the hunter was closing in. After that first unsettling discovery, the next 2 days for Sarah were a total blur of nervous energy. She completely ditched her usual routine of meticulous cataloging. Instead, she just clung to the cabin, her eyes constantly darting around, always checking over her shoulder. That familiar forest silence, which used to be so comforting, now felt louder and more ominous than ever. Then came the afternoon of the 6th day. The fog rolled in thicker than she'd ever seen it, painting everything in shades of muted gray and green. Sarah was out by the fence line, trying to steady her breathing, forcing herself to be calm, when suddenly she saw it. Not a face, not a figure, but a color that screamed wrong place, wrong time in the natural palette of the woods. Deep in the underbrush, about 60 yards away, was this dull, dirty yellow. It was too muted to be a flower, too structured to be some fungus. It looked like a block of unnatural fabric, the color of old mustard or dried pollen. It flashed through the dense gray-green for less than a second, a tall, linear shape moving swiftly behind the firs. And then, just like that, it was gone. Sarah blinked, convinced it was just the fog playing tricks, or maybe a full-blown panic attack. But the image was so clear, so specific. A vertical line of yellow, like an old, cheap raincoat, cutting through the uniform gray. It vanished so fast, so completely, she couldn't even tell you which tree it had passed. All that was left was this lingering, unsettling certainty that the color was deliberate, an impossible beacon placed in the unyielding camouflage of the Pacific Northwest woods. The feeling of being watched was no longer a flicker in the back of my mind. It was a constant, heavy weight pressing down on me. It was like a physical presence, a pair of eyes I could feel but never see, burrowed deep into the woods that surrounded my cabin. I knew I couldn't stay locked inside forever. My supplies were dwindling. The neat rows of canned goods in the pantry were looking sparse. And more than that, the isolation was starting to get to me. The silence was becoming a roar in my ears. I needed to break it, even for just an hour. I needed to see another human face, to hear another voice besides the one in my head. So I fired up my old, reliable Jeep. The engine coughed to life, a rough sound that seemed to slice through the oppressive quiet of the forest. Driving down that long, winding service road felt like navigating a gauntlet. My eyes were a frantic dance between the rearview mirror, searching for any sign of pursuit, and the dense, dark woods that lined the path. Every shadow seemed to move. Every rustle of leaves sounded like a footstep. Was it just my imagination, or was the forest itself holding its breath, watching me go? The 20 miles to the nearest town felt like 100. It was a tiny place, barely a crossroads with a general store, a gas station, and a few houses clustered together as if for warmth. The trip was a blur of nervous energy. I filled the Jeep with fuel, the smell of gasoline sharp and grounding. Inside the store, I grabbed everything I could think of: canned beans, coffee, flour, batteries. The cashier, a man with a weathered face and kind eyes, gave me a friendly nod. "Stocking up for winter?" he asked. I just mumbled something in reply, my gaze darting towards the door. The brief human interaction did little to soothe the knot of fear in my stomach. Then, against my better judgment, my eyes landed on a display case near the counter. It was filled with an assortment of pocket knives and tools. I found myself pointing to a sturdy hunting knife with a black handle. I didn't know what I'd do with it, but the weight of it in my hand as I walked back to the Jeep felt like a small, cold comfort. A useless one, probably, but a comfort nonetheless. The drive back was even worse. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long, distorted shadows across the road. The Jeep felt heavier now, laden with provisions and the new, grim weight of the knife in my bag. Each mile closer to the cabin tightened the knot in my chest. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a figure emerge from the tree line. Nothing. Just the empty, dusty road spooling out behind me. When I finally pulled into the clearing, the cabin was there. Just as I'd left it, it looked solid, defiant, a small bastion of order against the chaos of the wilderness. For a moment, a wave of relief washed over me. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding, my shoulders slumping just a fraction. It was okay. Everything was okay. I started unloading the groceries, making quick trips from the Jeep to the porch. The air was still, unnervingly so. The usual evening chorus of birds and insects was absent. There was only silence. On my last trip, carrying the final bag, I glanced down at the porch steps and froze. My heart hammered against my ribs. A frantic bird trapped in a cage. The cairn, the little stack of river stones I'd built by the steps, was still there. But it had been changed. Something new had been added, resting perfectly on the topmost stone, the smoothest one of the pile, was a small, delicate bird skull, It was flawlessly clean, bleached bone white by the sun, and placed with an almost surgical precision. The horror of it was absolute, a cold spike driving through my chest. This wasn't just a random animal bone. Its placement was deliberate. It was a message. My stalker, the source of my creeping dread, hadn't just been lurking at the edge of my property. They had crossed the line. They had stood right here on my porch, just feet from my front door. They had left this token, this macabre gift. The violation was total. It was a statement, clearer and more chilling than any written note could ever be. It said, "I am here. I can get to you whenever I want. I was watching you leave, and I have been waiting for your return." The stark white of the bone against the dark gray of the river stone was a signature, a terrifying, cold-blooded signature. It confirmed my deepest, darkest fear. This wasn't some random wanderer in the woods. My stalker was intelligent. They were patient, and they were utterly, terrifyingly detached from whatever it is that makes us human. The woods no longer felt like a place of solitude. They felt like a cage, and I had just been shown that the lock was on the outside. Sarah was feeling more and more isolated, sensing an unseen presence, and grappling with the oppressive, misty atmosphere around the cabin. She was desperate for answers, for any kind of context to what she was experiencing, and that desperation led her to a dusty, forgotten corner of the cabin. A small built-in bookshelf, you know, the kind usually filled with random paperbacks and board games that are missing half their pieces. But Sarah found something else entirely. Tucked away amongst some old travel guides was a thick, leather-bound journal. It wasn't just any journal. It was a guest experience log, thoughtfully left by the rental company. At first glance, it seemed pretty innocuous, probably just a place for guests to jot down notes about their stay. But as Sarah picked it up, she could feel the weight of decades within its pages. The journal dated all the way back to the late 1990s. Imagine all the stories, all the different lives that had passed through that cabin and left a little piece of themselves in those pages. Her heart pounded a little faster as she opened it, hoping to find something, anything that might explain the weird vibes. She started flipping through the entries, page after page, year after year. Most of it was, well, pretty mundane. You had your typical guest complaints. The sulfur water smells a bit funny, or could use more firewood. Then there were the compliments. The fireplace is so cozy, or loved the starry nights, and, of course, the local tips. Great fishing spot down by the creek, or saw a deer this morning. It was all very standard, very much what you'd expect from a remote cabin rental. Sarah sighed, a little deflated. She'd hoped for some kind of dramatic revelation, but it was just regular. She kept flipping, her fingers growing tired, her initial hope starting to wane. She was about to give up, thinking it was just a dead end. Another false lead in her increasingly confusing ordeal. But then, as she neared the middle of the thick journal, something shifted. The tone of the entries changed. Drastically. She hit a section that definitely wasn't about fishing or cozy fireplaces, or even the smell of the water. The handwriting became less neat, more hurried, almost frantic. The entries themselves became shorter, punchier, and filled with a growing sense of unease. And what was truly chilling, they were strangely consistent. Not consistent in a good way, like everyone praising the same beautiful view, but consistent in a way that screamed shared dread. Her eyes landed on an entry dated October 14th, 2003. It read, "The quiet is getting to me. I keep thinking I see things move outside the windows. My dog won't go out after sunset. I'm leaving early." Wow. Imagine feeling so creeped out that you cut your vacation short. That's a serious red flag right there. Sarah felt a cold knot form in her stomach. This wasn't just a quirky cabin with some old tales. Something real was happening here, or at least something real had happened to multiple people. She continued dread building with each new date. July 22nd, 2011. Found a knot of dried grass braided on my doorstep. I didn't make it. Nobody else is here. I saw a flash of color in the trees today. I hope I'm just tired. Okay, now we're getting into seriously weird territory. A braided knot of grass. I didn't make it. What did that even mean? And that flash of color in the trees. It immediately brought to Sarah's mind the unnatural yellow she'd glimpsed, that strange, almost sickly hue in the mist. Was it just a coincidence? Or was there a pattern emerging, a thread connecting these disparate experiences across the years? The guessed as desperate hope of, "I hope I am just tired," was so poignant, so relatable to Sarah's own attempts to rationalize her fear. But the next entry, dated May 1st, 2015, was the one that truly made Sarah's breath hitch. She leaned closer, her eyes tracing the frantic, almost spiky handwriting. "There is a man. He doesn't walk the trails, he just stands. The windows are streaming with rain, but he doesn't seem to get wet. I'm packing now. This is not a man. Oh, my goodness. This is not a man." Those 5 words hung in the air, echoing in Sarah's mind, chilling her to the bone. Her own experience, the relentless mist, the figure she'd seen. It all rushed back. The man who never seems to get wet. The detail was so specific, so utterly unique, that it couldn't be a coincidence. It tied her current, terrifying predicament directly to a pattern spanning 2 decades. An ongoing nightmare for anyone unfortunate enough to stay in that cabin. The paranoia wasn't hers alone. It wasn't a figment of her imagination, or the cabin fever getting to her. It was a tenant of the cabin, a persistent, malevolent presence, woven into the very fabric of that remote clearing. Sarah reread the entry, her finger tracing the words, a silent scream building in her throat. This wasn't just a random stalker. It was a phenomenon, a localized legend that had been quietly, menacingly unfolding for years. This discovery, while terrifying, offered a strange, grim sort of clarity. She wasn't crazy. She wasn't imagining things, but the comfort that might bring was immediately overshadowed by the horrifying realization that she was starring in a script that had already trapped and possibly broken others before her. She was just the latest victim in a story that had been playing out for decades. A story with a mysterious, unkillable figure at its heart. The entry about the man who never seems to get wet deeply unsettled Sarah, shaking her to her core in a way nothing else had. It wasn't just a physical threat anymore. It was something far more sinister, something supernatural. The psychological strain was becoming unbearable, a heavy weight pressing down on her every waking moment. She found herself sleeping in short, fitful bursts, her mind refusing to truly rest, waking to the slightest creak of the old wood, her heart pounding in her chest. That evening, the weather outside was absolutely relentless. Rain hammered against the roof in sheets, each drop sounding like a tiny drum against the aged timber. The wind, a wild, mournful beast, howled through the chimneys, rattling the very foundations of the cabin. Sarah stood by the kitchen window, her gaze lost in the impenetrable blackness outside, rain-streaked and distorted. She was trying desperately to see beyond her own reflection, to find some anchor in the chaotic night. Then it happened. In the glass superimposed over her own pale, anxious image, she saw a shadow. It was tall, indistinct, a vague outline that sent a shiver of pure dread down her spine. But it was undeniably behind her. It moved with a disturbing fluidity, a flicker of movement that shouldn't have been there, a silent ripple in the mirrored surface of the window. She whirled around, her heart leaping into her throat, a choked gasp escaping her lips. The fireplace poker, which she'd instinctively kept beside her bed for days, was clutched tightly in her hand, held high like a makeshift weapon. Nothing. The kitchen was utterly empty. The only sound was the violent drumming of the rain outside, a brutal symphony against the cabin walls. She stood there, frozen, her breath catching in her chest, the poker trembling slightly in her grip. Slowly, reluctantly, she turned back to the window. Only her own face, pale and distorted by the rivulets of water running down the pane, looked back at her. The figure, if it had truly existed, had vanished into the mere 3 feet of cabin space between her and the wall. Had she seen a ghost? A terrifying hallucination, brought on by the suffocating combination of exhaustion and sheer terror. The incident was a cruel new game, a twisted trick of the mind. It was making her doubt her own senses, blurring the already fragile line between a physical, tangible threat and a complete mental breakdown. But the terror she felt, that cold, gripping fear, felt incredibly real. And the figure in the glass, that shadowy, moving presence, had been taller than any ordinary man she'd ever known. It had been impossibly tall. The night, already a torment, had just added another layer of unbearable, chilling uncertainty to Sarah's ordeal. This cabin, once her sanctuary, was rapidly becoming her deepest nightmare. Every creak, every shadow, every drop of rain now held a new sinister meaning, and she was utterly alone to face it. The psychological games had to end. Enough was enough. The moment the physical evidence, the undeniable proof came back, something inside Sarah snapped. This wasn't a game of shadows and whispers anymore. It was a cold, hard reality. Sanity, she decided with a sudden, chilling clarity, demanded escape. She couldn't afford to wait for her weekly check-in. Couldn't risk another day, another night, in this place that had become a prison of the mind. She had to leave, and she had to leave now. Her hands, trembling slightly, snatched her car keys from the hook by the door. Her mind, usually a jumble of anxieties, sharpened into a razor-focused instrument. It raced through a mental checklist, a rapid-fire sequence of actions required for a quick, clean exit. First on that list, the absolute non-negotiable, was her emergency kit. It wasn't in the cabin. For safety and accessibility, she kept it stored in the small exterior woodshed, a weathered structure standing about 20 yards from the main cabin. The woodshed was an old thing, built from heavy, dark planks of wood that had seen decades of mountain weather. Its door was secured with a simple, sturdy padlock. As she approached, her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the otherwise silent woods. Her eyes fixed on the lock. It was intact. The hasp, the metal loop that the lock went through, was still perfectly aligned. A small, shaky sigh of relief escaped her lips. Maybe, just maybe, this one thing had been left untouched. Maybe this one fear was unfounded. She fumbled with the key, her fingers clumsy with adrenaline. The lock clicked open. She pulled the door, its old hinges groaning in protest, and peered into the familiar gloom. There it was, the heavy plastic toolbox, a bright red beacon in the dusty shadows, sat right where she'd left it. This box was her lifeline, containing the essentials for any roadside disaster: jumper cables, tire change tools, and a set of emergency flares. She reached in, her fingers wrapping around the handle, and pulled. The moment she lifted it, a new kind of dread, cold and sharp, pierced through her fleeting relief. It was too light, far too light. The box should have had a significant heft to it, a reassuring weight that spoke of heavy tools and thick cables. This felt hollow. With a surge of panic, she dropped the box onto the dirt floor and threw open the lid. Her eyes scanned the contents, desperate and wild. The flares were there, their bright plastic casings untouched. The tire iron, a solid piece of steel, lay in its molded compartment. The small emergency water bottle was present. Everything seemed to be in its place. A perfect tableau of preparedness, but it wasn't perfect. One crucial item was gone. The heavy-duty jumper cables, a thick, coiled length of red and black rubber and copper, were missing. They weren't just missing. The space where they should have been was empty, a gaping void in the otherwise organized kit. The cables were heavy. They were bulky. They were the kind of thing you couldn't misplace, the kind of thing you would never forget to put back. It was impossible. The realization slammed into her with the force of a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. This wasn't random. This wasn't a prank. Whoever this person was, whatever they weren't just leaving trinkets on her porch or whispering from the trees. They were intelligent. They were methodical. A chilling sequence of events played out in her mind. They had approached the shed not with a rock or a crowbar, but with tools. They had picked the lock, a skill that required knowledge and a steady hand. They had opened it, surveyed the contents, and deliberately taken the one single item that could restart a dead battery in the middle of nowhere. The one item that guaranteed her an exit if her car failed. And then, with a terrifying display of foresight, they had carefully relocked the shed, leaving no sign of entry, concealing the theft until the moment she needed it most. This was a premeditated move. It was a definitive act of isolation, executed with chilling precision. They were systematically, patiently, stripping away her ability to leave. Trapped and absolutely paranoid, Sarah knew she had to take action. She couldn't just sit there, waiting. Her mind raced back to the professional-grade audio recorder she'd packed. Ironic, really. She'd brought it to catalog the beautiful sounds of local birds, never in a million years expecting to use it to record. Well, her potential killer. This wasn't some nature documentary. This was her life. Before darkness fully claimed the cabin, she moved with a newfound, desperate resolve. Her fingers trembled slightly as she pried up a loose floorboard in the kitchen. It was directly under the window, facing outwards. Perfect. Carefully, she tucked the tiny device into its makeshift hiding spot, aiming it towards the eerie silence outside. She set it to record continuously through the entire night, praying it would capture something, anything, that could give her an answer, or at least a clue. The night stretched on, each creak and groan of the old cabin amplified by her anxiety. Sleep was a luxury she couldn't afford. The first hint of dawn brought with it a cold, unsettling relief. As soon as the first sliver of light pierced the heavy curtains, She snatched up the recorder, her heart hammering against her ribs. She couldn't listen out in the open. She needed absolute isolation, absolute focus. Retreating to the deepest, darkest corner of the cabin, she pulled out her small, noise-isolating headphones. They were designed for delicate bird calls, for pristine sound. And now, they were her only link to whatever horrors lurked outside. She pressed play, holding her breath, for what felt like an eternity, but was probably just the first hour. There was only the clean, rhythmic static of the wind whistling through the trees, and the constant monotonous trickle of water somewhere nearby. Her shoulders slumped slightly. Had she imagined it all? Was it just her own fear creating monsters in the shadows? Then, around 4:30 a.m., faintly at first, the sound returned. It was undeniable, the rhythmic dragging, the same heavy, sickening sound from before, but this time it was much, much closer. It moved in slow, deliberate, heavy arcs right across the porch, the scraping noise echoing eerily in her headphones. Sarah gripped the recorder, her knuckles turning stark white as blood drained from her fingers. Every muscle in her body tensed, preparing for what? She didn't know. The dragging sound stopped, an agonizing pause, nearly a full minute, stretched out, filled only by the relentless wind. Her eyes darted around the shadowed cabin, convinced something was watching her, even though she knew she was alone. The silence felt heavier than the sound itself. And then it came, a whisper, low, distorted, impossibly close to the microphone. It wasn't a word she could recognize, not anything from any language she'd ever heard. Maybe a garbled name, a command, spoken in a language lost to the very woods surrounding her. The sound seemed to stretch and compress, almost vibrating with an unnatural frequency, sending a shiver of ice straight down her spine. As she listened, the hair stood up on her arms, a primal warning system screaming within her. What truly unnerved her, what made her stomach lurch with a cold, sickly fear, was the quality of the voice. It sounded wet and deep, as if the speaker's vocal cords were saturated with water, completely waterlogged. Yet, paradoxically, the sound was completely crisp, not muffled or distorted by the constant, heavy rain that had plagued the area for days. It was clear, chillingly precise. It was the sound of something speaking from within a perpetually soaked, protected enclosure, something that existed in a state of constant, unnatural dampness, yet remained perfectly articulated. What kind of creature could produce such a sound? Sarah felt a cold dread seep into her bones. The recorder now felt less like a tool for answers, and more like a conduit to an unspeakable terror. She had her proof, but at what cost? And what was she going to do with it? The cabin, once her sanctuary, now felt like a cage, and whatever was outside was listening. My jumper cables were gone, vanished, just like the cell service. I ran back inside, heart hammering against my ribs, and snatched the landline receiver. Dead. Utterly, completely dead. I traced the cord to the window and saw it. A thick branch, snapped by the storm, had torn the line clean from the pole. The whispers I'd been hearing, the feeling of being watched. It wasn't just paranoia anymore. This was real. This was happening. Fear, cold and sharp, had morphed into a primal, absolute necessity. I had to get out. Now. I moved with a frantic, desperate energy, grabbing the last of the non-perishable food, the water bottles, my emergency first aid kit. I stuffed everything into my duffel bag, my hands shaking so badly I could barely zip it. My eyes landed on the hunting knife I kept for camping. Without a second thought, I strapped the sheath to my belt. It felt flimsy, pathetic, but it was something. I threw the bag into the back of the Jeep, my gaze constantly scanning the tree line, the shadows, the oppressive gray sky, every rustle of leaves, every drip of water from the pines sounded like a footstep. The engine turning over was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. I didn't bother locking the cabin door. What was the point? I slammed the Jeep into drive and peeled out, tires spitting gravel and mud. The service road was a treacherous mess of ruts and washouts, but I didn't care. I pushed the accelerator, my foot heavy, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. The Jeep fishtailed, sliding through the muck, but I held it steady. My focus narrowed to a single point, the main road, civilization, safety. My eyes kept flicking to the rearview mirror. Was that a flash of yellow behind the trees? A trick of the light? My mind was playing cruel games, transforming every shadow, every swaying branch into the silhouette of the figure in the yellow coat. The feeling of being pursued was a physical weight pressing down on me, urging me to go faster, faster. The needle on the speedometer climbed to a reckless speed for such a treacherous road, the suspension groaning in protest as I hit another pothole. I didn't slow down. I couldn't. I was getting close. I could feel it. The dense forest was starting to thin just slightly. Another mile, maybe less, and I'd hit the smooth, black asphalt of the main highway. The thought was a beacon of hope in the terrifying darkness that had become my reality. I rounded a sharp, blind corner, the tires screaming for purchase on the loose gravel. And then I saw it. My foot slammed on the brake pedal, the anti-lock system chattering as the Jeep skidded to a halt just inches from the obstacle. My breath hitched, caught in my throat. The road was blocked, completely, utterly impassable. But this wasn't a natural landslide. This was a barricade. 3 immense ancient fir trees, their trunks as thick as my Jeep, lay perfectly across the road. They were freshly cut, the raw wood a pale scar against the dark bark. They were stacked, one on top of the other, their colossal forms intersecting with a horrifying, geometric precision. A deliberate wall of timber. I stared, my mind struggling to process the sheer scale of it. These trees were giants, hundreds of years old. To fell them, to move them, to stack them with such accuracy, it would take a crane, a logging crew, heavy machinery, or a team of incredibly strong people working for hours. I scanned the muddy ground around the barricade. There were no tire tracks other than my own, no sawdust, no sign of the immense effort it must have taken. Just the clean, precise cuts on the timber and the deafening silence of the forest. The sheer impossibility of it stole the air from my lungs. This wasn't just being trapped by a storm. This was being caged, imprisoned by a methodical, intelligent, and terrifyingly powerful force that had anticipated my every move. They hadn't just cut off my escape. They had built the walls of my prison, ensuring there was absolutely no way out, working quickly. A sense of urgency pressing in on her, Sarah began to search the ruined cabin. She needed context, some explanation for the chilling events unfolding around her. Her gaze swept across the debris, the broken timbers, and scattered remnants of a life once lived here. Underneath a collapsed shelf, half buried by crumbling wood and sodden leaves, she spotted something. A small, leather-bound book. It was waterlogged and swollen, its pages fused together by time and dampness. This wasn't just any old book. It was a scrapbook, a tangible piece of the past, dating all the way back to the late 1960s and early 70s. With painstaking care, her fingers trembling slightly, Sarah managed to pry open a few of the stubborn pages. What she found sent a cold shiver down her spine. There were faded newspaper clippings about local logging disputes, a stark reminder of the area's history. But far more disturbing were the grainy, almost frantic, handwritten entries. They were penned by a man named Elias, and with each word, a chilling portrait of paranoia began to emerge. Elias meticulously described his life in the cabin, but his sanity seemed to unravel with every passing year. He became increasingly convinced, through his rambling prose, that everything around him was part of a vast, sinister government conspiracy. The local radio signals, the planes flying overhead, even the innocent deer foraging in the woods. He believed they were all components of an elaborate surveillance system designed to monitor and, eventually, eliminate him. His world was closing in, defined by an unseen enemy. A recurring, almost obsessive theme appeared throughout his entries: his protective skin. This, he claimed, was his yellow raincoat, which he believed shielded him from their frequencies. The idea was both tragic and terrifying, painting a picture of a man utterly consumed by his delusions. The final entry, dated 1978, was a shaky, almost illegible scrawl. The words themselves felt like a physical blow. "They think they have me cornered," Elias had written, his despair and defiance palpable. "They think the silence is theirs. I will teach them the silence is mine. Every one of them who tries to take my place will learn the price of the yellow skin." The cryptic threat resonated like a mournful gong in the silence of the ruined cabin. Sarah's blood ran cold. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Elias, the paranoid hermit, was the man in the yellow raincoat. He had claimed this clearing, this lonely stretch of wilderness, long ago. Whether he was a ghost, a spectral echo of his own madness, or simply an impossibly old man driven to the brink by years of isolation and delusion, one thing was terrifyingly clear. He viewed Sarah as nothing more than a replacement, an intruder to be eliminated. This wasn't just a place. It was Elias's domain, and he intended to defend it, no matter the cost. His silence was a promise of vengeance, a chilling legacy that now threatened Sarah's very life. The yellow raincoat wasn't just a garment. It was a symbol of a possessive, dangerous madness that still stalked these woods. The main road was completely blocked. There was no way through. It was a dead end, a deliberate, calculated trap. A wave of cold dread washed over me, but it was quickly replaced by a surge of adrenaline. They wanted me to be trapped, to feel helpless, but I wouldn't give them the satisfaction. If the road was closed, I would make my own path. My only hope was to find an alternative route, maybe an old logging trail, a game path, anything that could lead me away from this nightmare. Switching on my phone's GPS, I turned my back on the barricade and plunged deep into the woods, moving in the opposite direction. The forest was dense, a suffocating maze of tangled branches and thick undergrowth that clawed at my clothes and skin. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves sent a jolt of fear through me. Was he watching? Was he following? I pushed the thoughts away, focusing only on the digital map and the forward momentum. One foot in front of the other. Keep moving. For 2 agonizing hours I pushed through the relentless brush, My muscles ached and scratches lined my arms and face, but I didn't dare stop. Then I noticed something, a subtle shift in the landscape. The chaotic jumble of trees began to show a faint, almost imperceptible alignment. It was a straight line where nature should have been random, a ghost of an old, forgotten boundary. It wasn't much, but it was a path, a sign that someone had been here long ago. Hope, fragile as it was, flickered within me, following this barely visible track. I felt a change in the air. The woods grew quieter, the light dimmer. The trees seemed to press in closer, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching for me. The feeling of being watched intensified, the heavy, malevolent presence that made the hair on my arms stand on end. The faint trail led me onward, deeper into the suffocating silence. Then, the forest suddenly opened up. I stumbled into a small, dark clearing, a circular patch of dead earth where nothing grew. The air was heavy, stagnant, and unnaturally cold. A profound sense of wrongness permeated the space, a deep-seated evil that seemed to emanate from the very soil. And in the center of this desolate clearing stood another cabin. This structure was a stark contrast to the one I had rented. It was ancient, a ruin of rotting logs and crumbling stone, almost completely swallowed by a thick blanket of moss and ivy. The roof had partially collapsed, and the windows were dark, empty sockets staring out into the gloom. It didn't just look old. It felt ancient, like it had been squatting in this clearing for centuries, a festering wound in the heart of the forest. It radiated an aura of decay and sorrow, and a terrifying thought took root in my mind. This was the source. This was the heart of the evil that haunted this place. My entire body screamed at me to run, to get as far away from this place as possible. But I couldn't. I was drawn to it, compelled by a morbid need to understand, to see the origin of my terror. My hand trembled as I reached for the splintered, warped door. It hung askew on a single rusted hinge, groaning in protest as I hesitantly pushed it open. The stench hit me first, a gag-inducing mix of damp earth, decaying wood, and thick, cloying mold. The inside was a chaotic mess. Furniture had rotted into unrecognizable piles of dark, damp pulp. The floor was a treacherous landscape of collapsed timbers and slick fungus. Cobwebs as thick as cotton hung from the ceiling like funeral shrouds. It was a tomb, a monument to decay. My eyes scanned the desolate interior, trying to make sense of the chaos. Then I saw it. In the far corner, next to a rusted iron stove that looked like a corroded beast, stood a single wooden peg hammered into the wall, and hanging from that peg, coated in a thick, grimy layer of dust and time, was a yellow raincoat. My breath hitched in my throat. It was an antique design, made of a heavy, vinyl-like material. The color was a sickly, muted yellow, faded and sticky with decades of moisture and rot. It was the exact same unnatural, disturbing shade of yellow I had glimpsed in the woods, the color that had been burned into my memory. A wave of nausea and overwhelming dread washed over me. This was it. This was his home. This decaying ruin was where the man in the yellow raincoat had lived, and perhaps where he had died. The coat wasn't just an object. It was a relic, a physical manifestation of the presence that had been tormenting me. I had found the source, and in doing so, I felt like I had stepped into the ghost's grave, with the horrifying truth from the scrapbook burning in my mind. I fled the ruined cabin, the old yellow raincoat still hanging on the wall, felt like a specter watching me go. I had to get away, get back to my own cabin, and then out of this cursed forest. Survival was the only thought propelling my feet, a desperate drumbeat against the forest floor that drowned out the creeping fear. I ran, branches whipping at my face, my breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. The urgency was a physical force, shoving me forward, screaming at me to leave, to escape, no matter what. Then, I burst through the final line of trees and into the clearing where my cabin stood. And I stopped. All the air left my lungs, all the momentum drained from my body, leaving me frozen in place. He was there, at the far edge of the clearing, perfectly framed by the oppressive dark green wall of the woods. He stood. He was tall, gaunt, and absolutely motionless. A silent, terrifying statue. He wore the same style of Yellow Raincoat, but this one was different. It looked newer, cleaner, and the yellow was so unnaturally bright in the dim, fading light that it hurt my eyes. The hood was pulled up, casting his face into a void of absolute shadow. He didn't move. Not a twitch, not a shift of weight. It was as if he wasn't even breathing. He didn't acknowledge my sudden, panicked arrival. He was simply standing there, watching me. The silence that fell was the heaviest, most suffocating thing I had ever experienced. It was a total vacuum of sound, a void that seemed to be waiting patiently for my reaction. He wasn't hiding anymore. He was openly displaying his presence, a chilling confirmation. Was this Elias's successor? Or somehow, impossibly, Elias himself returned from the grave? The raw, primal terror of seeing him, my inescapable stalker, right there in the open, solidified everything. This was no longer just about escaping the woods. I was in a fight for my life. Every nerve ending screamed at me to run, but my feet were rooted to the spot. My mind raced, trying to process the impossible sight before me. The figure in the yellow raincoat was no longer a ghost story whispered in the dark. He was a solid, terrifying reality. He had been toying with me, a cat with a mouse, and now he was done with the game. His stillness was the most menacing part. It was a statement of power, of absolute confidence. He didn't need to chase me. He knew I was trapped. The forest was his domain, and I was just an intruder. My cabin, which had once felt like a sanctuary, now seemed like nothing more than a cage he had led me back to. I could feel his gaze on me, even though I couldn't see his eyes. It was a cold, analytical pressure, dissecting me from a distance. The scrapbooks of stories, the scratched messages, the feeling of being watched. It all crashed together into this single, horrifying image. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic prisoner trying to escape my chest. I took a shaky step back, my heel catching on a root. The tiny sound of a snapping twig echoed like a gunshot in the dead silence. The figure remained unmoved. It was a deliberate performance of intimidation, and it was working perfectly. Fear was a cold liquid, filling my veins, paralyzing my muscles. I knew I couldn't just stand here, waiting for him to make the first move. I had to do something, anything. My eyes darted to my cabin door. It was so close, maybe 50 feet away. Could I make it? Could I get inside, lock the door, and barricade myself in? It felt like a fool's hope. He was standing between me and the only path out of the clearing. To get to my car, I would have to go right past him. The impossibility of my situation settled over me like a shroud. He had anticipated my every move. He had herded me right where he wanted me. I forced myself to breathe, trying to think past the panic, the scrapbook, the stories. Elias, He had documented his victims, relished their fear. This new figure was doing the same. He was savoring this moment, this tableau of terror he had so carefully constructed. He wanted to see my fear. He wanted to see me break. That thought sparked something within me, a tiny flickering ember of defiance in the overwhelming darkness. I wouldn't give him the satisfaction. Slowly, deliberately, I straightened up. I met the empty space where his face should be, my gaze unwavering. I wouldn't run blindly. I wouldn't scream. I would face him. The silence stretched on. A tense wire pulled taut between us. In that endless moment, the dynamic shifted. It was no longer just predator and prey. It was a confrontation. The clearing had become an arena, and the battle had just begun. He had revealed himself, and in doing so, he had given me a target. The fight for my life was here, and I had to survive. Sarah didn't hesitate. She scrambled inside her cabin, slamming the heavy cedar door shut and ramming the thick metal bolt home with a resounding clank that echoed the frantic beat of her own heart. The sound, usually a comfort, now felt like the first note in a symphony of terror. Her breath came in ragged gasps, misting in the cool air of the cabin. She immediately began barricading, a primal instinct taking over. Every heavy object she could move became a part of her desperate fortress. The heavy wooden table, a testament to her grandfather's craftsmanship, was dragged across the floor, its legs scraping a protest against the polished wood. Next came the dresser, its drawers rattling with her belongings. A lifetime of memories, now just dead weight against a looming threat. She hauled stacks of logs for the fireplace, each one a solid, reassuring weight in her arms, and piled them against the windows until the last slivers of twilight were choked out, plunging the cabin into a deep, claustrophobic gloom. Her only light was the faint, ghostly glow from the dying embers in the hearth. In this self-imposed darkness, her senses sharpened to an excruciating degree. Every creak of the old cabin, every rustle of leaves outside, became a potential harbinger of doom. She needed a weapon. Her eyes scanned the room, landing on the fireplace. She grabbed the heaviest, most lethal implement she had, the iron fireplace poker. Its cold, unyielding weight was a small comfort in her trembling hands. She tested its heft, swinging it once through the air, the soft whoosh a grim promise. She took her position in the center of the room, a lone warrior in a besieged castle, her back to the warmth of the dying fire, and stood ready. Her heart pounded against her ribs, a frantic drum against the encroaching silence. The silence was the worst part. It stretched on, thick and heavy, allowing her imagination to paint vivid, horrifying pictures of the face that belonged to the Yellow Raincoat. The figure did not rush. He was patient, a predator toying with its cornered prey. This was not a mindless assault. It was a game, and he was setting the rules. The game began systematically, a calculated psychological warfare. First, a light, almost inquisitive tap on the main window. Tap, tap, tap. It was a sound meant to disorient her, to make her question her own senses. Was it just a branch? A bird? A sound meant to gaslight her, suggesting a minor natural disturbance. Sarah's grip tightened on the poker, her knuckles white. She knew better. It was him. He was announcing his presence, letting her know he was there, just outside her makeshift defenses. Then, as suddenly as it began, silence descended again. A thick, suffocating silence that was more terrifying than any noise. 5 long, agonizing minutes crawled by, each second stretching into an eternity. Her ears strained, trying to catch any sound over the frantic thumping in her chest. Then, a new sound from a different direction. The back door, her routine entry point. A slow, firm turn of the knob. The metallic click, click, click was horrifyingly loud in the stillness. He was testing it, confirming he knew her habits, her patterns. He knew this was the door she used most often, the one whose lock was perhaps older, weaker. When the knob held firm, a brief pause followed. Sarah could almost picture him standing there, perhaps a small, cruel smile playing on his unseen lips. The game was escalating. The testing phase was over. He began to work on the frame. The first impacts were heavy, rhythmic thuds, shoulder weight impacts designed to test the door's overall integrity. Thump, thump, thump. The entire cabin seemed to shudder with each blow. Dust motes danced in the faint firelight. Sarah flinched with every impact, the vibrations traveling up from the floorboards, through her feet, and into her very bones. He was strong, incredibly strong. The solid wood of the door, which had always felt so impenetrable, now seemed fragile, like a piece of paper. The thudding stopped. Silence again. He was listening, gauging the effect of his assault. Then came a different sound. Sharp, calculated blows aimed at a specific point. The hinges. Crack. A splintering sound, sharp and clear. He was dismantling her defense piece by piece, with a terrifying precision. He wasn't just trying to break the door down. He was taking it apart. Crack. Another blow, this one louder, closer. The sound of splintering wood was terrifyingly close now, a visceral, sickening noise that spoke of violation and imminent entry. Sarah backed away from the door, her heart a wild bird trapped in her ribs. She could hear his grunts of effort now, low and guttural, the sounds of a man utterly focused on his task. The wood groaned and protested, its fibers tearing apart under the relentless assault. She could visualize the damage, the metal of the hinges bending, the screws being ripped from the frame. He moved his attention from the hinges to the lock. The impacts became more brutal, more focused. He was aiming for the deadbolt, the last line of defense she had set. A final, brutal crash echoed through the cabin as the lower lock ripped out of the door frame entirely. The sound was a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. It was over. The door was compromised. Sarah braced herself, raising the iron poker high above her head, her muscles screaming with tension. Sweat stung her eyes, blurring the already dim room. Her knuckles were white, her grip so tight she thought the iron might fuse with her skin. The heavy door groaned inward, a slow, agonizing sound of defeat. A jagged vertical gap appeared where the wood had failed, a dark, menacing wound in the side of her sanctuary. Through the gap, she could see a sliver of the world outside and a sliver of her nightmare. The hem of the yellow raincoat, stark and vivid against the night, and below it, a dark, wet boot planted firmly on her threshold, a silent declaration of entry, of ownership. The game was over. The hunt had begun. The boot didn't move. It just stood there, a silent, ominous presence in the breach. Sarah held her breath, every fiber of her being screaming. The gap in the door was a gaping maw, and through it, she could feel the cold night air, carrying with it the scent of wet earth, pine, and something else, something metallic and coppery. Blood. The silence stretched, taut and electric. He wasn't rushing in. He was savoring this moment, letting the terror build, letting her stew in the certainty of her doom. Through the crack, she saw a hand, gloved in black leather, reach up and grip the splintered edge of the door. The fingers curled around the wood, slow and deliberate. With a final ear-splitting screech of protesting wood, he ripped the door open just enough to step through. He filled the doorway, a hulking silhouette against the faint moonlight that now streamed in. The yellow raincoat seemed to glow, an unnatural beacon in the darkness. His head was bowed, his face obscured by the deep shadow of his hood. He stood there for a long moment, water dripping from the brim of his hood onto the wooden floor. Drip, drip, drip. Each drop was like a hammer blow to Sarah's sanity. He took a slow step inside, the wet boot squelching on the floorboards. Then another. He moved with a strange, almost liquid grace, a chilling contrast to the brutal force he had just unleashed. He didn't look at her immediately. Instead, his hooded head tilted, scanning the room, taking in the pathetic barricades, the overturned furniture, the dying fire. It was as if he was an art critic, appraising her desperate, final masterpiece of fear. Sarah's arms ached from holding the poker aloft. Her throat was raw, but she couldn't scream. The sound was trapped behind a wall of pure terror. Finally, his head turned towards her. She still couldn't see his face, only the deep, impenetrable blackness within the hood. But she could feel his gaze on her, a physical weight, cold and heavy. He took another step, and another, closing the distance between them with an unhurried, terrifying pace. He was a shark circling its prey, confident and utterly without mercy. The cabin, her home, her sanctuary, suddenly felt like a cage, and he was the keeper. Sarah's mind raced, searching for an escape, an advantage, anything. But there was nothing. The windows were blocked, the back door destroyed. There was only him, her, and the shrinking space between them. He stopped about 10 feet away from her. The only sounds were her own ragged breathing, the dripping of his coat, and the soft crackle of the last embers in the hearth. Then he spoke. His voice was not what she expected. It wasn't a growl or a snarl. It was low, calm, and unnervingly soft. A whisper that cut through the silence like a razor. "Did you really think," he said, the words slithering into the air, "that a wooden door could keep me out?" He slowly raised a hand and began to pull back his hood. Sarah squeezed her eyes shut. She didn't want to see. She didn't want to know the face of her monster. But she couldn't stop herself. Against her will, her eyelids fluttered open, just in time to see the shadows recede, and the face of her nightmare finally revealed in the faint, flickering glow of the fire. The figure stood in the doorway, momentarily backlit by a flash of brilliant, blinding lightning. The strike illuminated the scene for a fraction of a second, but it was long enough. The light revealed not a man, but an emptiness. The yellow raincoat was there, standing upright, its sleeves hanging by its sides, as if on an invisible coat rack. But beneath the cowl, where a face should have been, was only a skeletal, shadow-like entity, a dark silhouette against the sudden light, moving with the jerky, unnatural grace of something starved and ancient. The entity itself seemed to be made of shredded shadow and bone, and it smelled intensely of rot and damp earth. Sarah let out a raw, guttural scream and dove through the nearest window, shattering the glass and tearing her skin as she landed hard in the muddy clearing. She ran blindly, fueled by adrenaline and the sheer terror of what she had seen. She was found 2 days later by George, the site manager, miles from the cabin, incoherent and suffering from exposure. She never returned to the cabin, The local police investigated and found the barricades intact, the back door broken, and the windows shattered. But the cabin itself was empty. There was no trace of the yellow raincoat, the scrapbook, or any signs of a struggle. The only anomaly was found by the fire marshal, who noted a precise, small cairn of river stones, placed on the center of the cold, iron stove. A farewell monument of unnatural order. The case remains officially unsolved, but the entry in the old guest log endures, a cryptic warning to the next person seeking silence in the woods. The man who never seems to get wet.